And hello, welcome along. Hi, this is Kathy Frey, and welcome along to this week's IMCO Maternity Natural Health webinar. Welcome along to the International Maternity Healthcare Organisation. And yeah, welcome along to Fiona. Say hello, Fiona.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Or is it good morning where you are?
Could be good afternoon if they're in North America. Yeah, so look, welcome along, and we've got a really an interesting topic today because it's kind of outside our normal topic focus, because our normal topic focus is around pregnancy, but yeah, what happens at the end of it. So I heard about Fiona being able to talk on this topic, and I thought, you know what, this is so relevant, and even to a lot of us personally, right? So welcome along those of you that are here live today. And so Fiona is a menopause doula and creator and founder of the Menopause School. So I know that she'll go over a little bit of background on her and how that came to be. Because even with a background in biology and holistic therapy, Fiona's own experience of menopause was like hitting a brick wall. And I think that that would be true of many birth practitioners and many women who are around maternity stuff all the time. And yeah, so I think it's a great topic that we bring up today. So so Fiona's got a short PowerPoint that she's going to share with you, and don't hesitate to put through any questions if you're live here today and you have any, and we'll have a little bit of a chat period towards the end there. Yeah, so welcome, Fiona, and let me hand over to you.
Well, I thought we'd set the scene a little bit first of all before I dive into the slides, because I talk about missing the menopause memo. And when I started to uncover or discover what was actually happening, I was like really shocked, because I thought I was quite clever. And I'm sure, like you're a very clever person. You've been on and around female anatomy and physiology for a very long time. And you kind of like to think you know what's going on. And I really did think, I was really switched on. So I don't know what your personal experience was. But when I was trying to figure out what it was and why we didn't know, why we didn't talk about it, I started to get this realization that as soon as you walked in a room and started to talk about it, you couldn't stop people talking about it. So to me, it didn't feel like it was this thing that was taboo. I don't like that word, because I think it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if we keep saying that we don't talk about it for that reason, then we just will never get around to it. And one of the things that I realized eventually that was because we don't talk about menstruation. And so therefore we don't talk about menstruation and we don't talk about menopause, but we don't talk about menstruation because no one taught us how to. So when I started thinking about how can we create a way of talking about menopause that sets the scene, gives us the whole story, so that we understand how we got to that point of perimenopause and menopause and things like that, I realized that the missing piece of the puzzle was menstruation, and that's the missing menopause memo. So the other thing that I then realized, there was a lot more people who could then help educate others, talk about menstrual health. And who better than midwives, who are right at the point really of then, once somebody's had their baby, a couple of months later, they're going to start menstruating again. And it would be a really good opportunity to perhaps educate them on how their hormone highway is going to move on from here onwards, depending on their age. And then as I started, it's not just midwives, I just started realizing that there are lots of people in our world as females that we might come across. So we might go to a massage therapist or a holistic therapist of some kind, who might then be able to drop into the conversation, how are your periods? It's like, Well, no one asks that question, right? But wouldn't it be a good idea if we did? So I started to work on how we could actually explain this to people from periods to no periods and beyond, and join the dots between menstruation and menopause. And I've now created what I call the story of menopause. And I've created it into a set of graphic slides, which I've test driven recently with several groups. I've been teaching menopause for some time, but it's only recently that I've come up with this tool to help make the understanding a lot easier. And I found it gives people a lot of light bulb moments. So that's why I thought I'd choose to share these slides. And then you could ask me some questions. Would that work?
Yeah, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So
Okay. So
we're going to make sure we press all the right buttons now, Kath.
yeah, we just had a practice session of sharing screen that got a little complex. So that's great. There we go. Perfect.
There,
Yeah.
Look, listen, careful, I don't get too cocky now. All right, so I call it menopausology as well, because did you know there is actually no science of menopause? Whereas there should be, really. So everything else is an ology, but there is no ology to go with menopause. Can you still see my screen and hear me okay?
Yep, all good. Totally.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, that's fascinating in itself, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, how can it possibly be that there is not an ology to describe
for menopause? Wow.
Yeah, or menstrual health, kind of like this. You go to see one person about your periods, maybe, I don't know. You go to another person for when there's a problem, a gynecologist. You see somebody else that, like yourselves, when you're having the baby, which is as a result of menstruating, essentially, as the reproductive cycle. But there's nobody that kind of like sits in the middle and just makes sure that you're okay with everything, and that you have the information that you need to actually then understand your own physiology.
Because within gynecology, a lot of its focus is anatomy. Are things structurally as they should be? And quite often, nearly always, the reason that women go and see a gynecologist is because of problems, not because of normality, right? Yeah. So they think everything's fine until they try to conceive a baby, and then things aren't working, and then they start to do their investigations. So once fertility is over, and perhaps problems with menstruation, which the solution oftentimes is a hysterectomy, let's just get rid of the womb, and then you don't belong to a gynecologist anymore if you don't have a womb, practically.
Right. And when you're a young female, and when you're a young female, there's no one to go and ask about, is this normal? What is normal? You might get some instruction on what products to use and things like that, but you don't get taught about the different sensations, the different perhaps holistic solutions that you could look at, and things like that. So
certainly that would be within Eastern medicine. Menstruation is such a hugely important part of being able to ascertain health. So it is,
and it's really menstrual health to me is like it's like the fifth vital sign for me, and we talk about that a lot in the work that we do. So we try to join the dots. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you.
I'll hand over to you now. And take over.
Now what I've done is I have a lot of the pictures here that I'm going to go through with you. A few of them I've kind of grayed over, so we didn't have to go into that to the whole ones. I'll just give you an insight. because this is just a selection of the whole story, which we would normally go through in a set of slides, kind of like in an hour talk or something like that. And then we have another set called the Menopause Toolkit. So this would be kind of like step one of a menopause support session or an awareness session that could be facilitated within a community or a group of women. So I will start, as a good story start, with once upon a time. And the story of menopause actually starts the moment two X chromosomes unite. And 85% of your menstrual health journey is preordained within your DNA. When you get to the age of 8, approximately, we're working on average numbers here, this is when puberty starts, and essentially is when the ovaries switch on. But periods don't start for another couple of years, and that is actually called menarche. And I think it's actually quite a regal kind of word, and I think perhaps we should get people to start using that more often, because I think the moment of menarche sounds actually a little bit more interesting than when my period started. And then as we kind of take that next step, ovarian aging begins. We tend to reserve that terminology for when we get to menopause, but in fact, the aging begins at the point of menarche. So we have the uterus and the ovaries, which I'm sure you guys are very familiar with. From that point on, we are preordained to have approximately 450 cycles. Some reference books will say anything between 400 and 500. So we're going to sit in the middle with 450. When they first start, they can be quite irregular. The ovaries haven't quite got the hang of it. They're on a bit, then they're off a bit. But we become accustomed to the kind of irregularity. We start to get used to them, and then gradually they become regular until as we get to our late 20s. And hormone levels start to surge at this point, continuing to circulate around our entire bodies. Surprisingly, at 37, ovarian aging starts to accelerate. And this is determined by the number of follicles that we have remaining, which is on average about 25,000. So we've gone from 1 million to 25,000 at this point. This is when we reach what's commonly known as perimenopause, which is really puberty in reverse. As we travel along the menstrual health timeline, the next part of this continuum is when we reach menopause day, which is actually the moment or day in time when periods have stopped. And that's also known as the climacteric, another word I think we should be using, because again, it sounds more impressive. Now, the average age at which menopause day is reached, so this permanent cessation of periods, if we're looking at what we call the typical timeline here, the average age for white females is 51. There are variations according to ethnicity, and that could be like 46 for South Asian women and 49 for women on the subcontinent in India. And there are a couple of subtle variations for other cultures and races. And then the very next day, you're actually post-menopause, and that is until the day you die. If we're not following the typical journey from 12 to 51 and then post-menopause, it could be called early if it happens before the age of 45. Sometimes we can have chemically induced menopause, which might be due to medication for things like endometriosis or breast cancer. And we might have surgical menopause when the ovaries have been removed. And that also would bring us straight into post-menopause. If menopause day happens below the age of 40, it's termed premature ovarian insufficiency. Continuing with the story. Now, there's a big feature of the story, and that's hormones. So just to give you an overview, hormones are chemical messengers, and they work like a big city in the body and circulate in the blood system, and they're transported around, and they help to control the settings in our built-in operating system at a cellular level. And there's three you might be familiar with, called insulin, thyroxine, and cortisol. Nearly everybody's pretty much heard of those. Now, this is the part of the menopause story when we're in a group of women and you've got everybody listening that they start to go, okay, so how does this relate to me? Well, there are three particular hormones involved in the story of menstruation to menopause, and that's estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And you'll notice there's an S after estrogen, because I'm not sure if you know, but it's actually a collective noun. It's a whole family of major and minor hormones. Now, those three are actually made in males and female bodies. So all humans have these, and they're made in the testes and the ovaries. But not many people know that there's also non-ovarian sources, such as the adrenal glands, the liver, fat cells, bones, muscle, and my favorite, which actually blew my mind when I discovered that the brain actually makes these hormones as well. Now, they work way beyond pregnancy and periods and perimenopause. They're involved in heart, strength, bone, our metabolism, and every single cell in our body. They're important for power, brain, energy, and all sorts of things. And the body likes to have them at what I call the Goldilocks level. So there's not too much, not too little, but it's just right. But when there are changes in these levels, the body can find it really quite hard to do things in terms of both physical and mental health. So we like to try and keep everything back to the Goldilocks level. Now, we're born with some, but at puberty, everything changes. And this is when we get the variation from male to female. So if you remember, I said that the levels actually rise over age up until our late 20s. And then we reach the tipping point of accelerated aging at 37. Now, we might not notice anything going on at this point in time. If we were to plot the lifetime levels, it kind of looked like a rainbow. So they start, I'm going to do it like an aerobic structure. I think I'm back to front on your screens. So it starts as we get to puberty, the levels rise, they plateau around about our late 20s, and then we get to our late 30s and we reach this tipping point, and these sex hormone levels start to come down. And they support the 11 systems of the body. And this was one of the things that I really couldn't believe that no one had told me. And you actually don't have to peel back the curtain very far. There's some really easy to find research material showing you straight away that estrogens in particular feature extremely heavily in everything that we do, and not only our functional systems, our brain, and supporting other hormonal systems as well. But we also have daily 24-hour levels as well, which you might be familiar with as a circadian rhythm. And there's things that we can do to impact those levels during the 24-hour period that we call cofactors. So the way we might be breathing, sitting, our stress levels, the way we move, and the foods that we drink. But the body kind of really prefers it if we can help everything get back to the Goldilocks level. We also have another kind of rhythm, which is then exclusive to females, an infradian rhythm, which we call the menstrual cycle. And next to blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature, and pulse rate, it is like the fifth vital sign. And it's the powerhouse of female physiology. It can give us elements of creativity. It helps with our physical and emotional resilience as well. But what we need to be doing is looking at menstrual health and the bit beyond the bleed, not just the 7 days where we bleed and we don't die, but the whole cycle as well, because these fluctuating levels have an impact on us. So from the point of menarche to the point of menopause date is like 40 years, and we have 450 opportunities to tune in to ourselves and start to learn about our menstrual health. The rhythm is like a heartbeat, I think of it, and it can be anything between 21 to 35 days. But we're taught it's 28 days, but actually the statistics show that only about 16% of menstruators have a 28-day cycle. Now, when we first learn about menstrual health, it's very much in terms of reproduction, but there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. And the point of estrogen reaching its peak there when ovulation occurs is actually just one part of it. And in fact, the ovaries speak to the brain and the brain speaks back to the ovaries every single day. And those hormones then circulate the entire body, not just between the ovaries and the uterus. What we would often do then in a group session is dive a little bit deeper into perhaps what menstrual health is. And then we would talk about it being the conductor of a hormone orchestra. So I figured that I knew that you'd recently had a talk on menstrual health. So I thought we'd just move past those and talk about the menstrual health timeline, which I also discovered in as I started to research this like 6 or 7 years ago, that scientists call this a continuum, which sounds like something out of Star Trek. So it also makes the menstrual health timeline sound quite magical and mystical, in my opinion. And they call it a continuum because there's no finite moment when we know any of these hormone shifts are going to occur. So it's this seamless journey that we go on from menarche to the climacteric. So the average age of menopause, like I said, is 51. And we have plenty of opportunities to listen in and tune in and become more of a hormone detective and understand what is happening each and every time we have this infradian rhythm. We can do things like tracking our cycle, which can go way beyond fertility and way beyond actually just counting the days that you might bleed. We can journal and tap into how we're actually feeling as these hormones shift around. And then we can learn how to optimize how we may be moving, what we might be eating and drinking, and our stress levels. And in actual fact, we can do so much to actually help things that we find challenging during our bleed period, for example, or just before, things like PMS. Now, going back to the lifetime rainbow, this is then when things start to change at the point that we call perimenopause, so the tipping point at the roundabout 37. So we start to get a lot of fluctuations because the ovaries are doing this puberty in reverse situation where they're sometimes working, sometimes not, sometimes ovulating, and sometimes not. And this creates a huge change in the levels, particularly of estradiol, which is the core estrogen during the menstrual cycle. And if we don't ovulate, which becomes more common during perimenopause, we have a sudden drop in ovarian progesterone as well. And remember those 11 systems as well. So it has a huge impact. And at the point of perimenopause, we call these signs and symptoms or indicators that there's this shift in our menstrual health timeline, and we're just getting over the top of the rainbow. One of the talks recently, one of the doctors in the room actually said, "Oh, I'm at the pot of gold on the other side of the rainbow." And I thought that was a really cool analogy for postmenopause. But as we move along this menstrual health timeline, because of the huge role that these hormones play in every bodily system from head to toe, the signs and symptoms can be incredibly varied. There are no fixed number, although you will hear lots of stories about, 34, 48, 58, whatever. It really is unique to the individual. The data, the statistics tell us that this goes on 4 to 7 years. Super thirsty there. But as you see, the tipping point is 37. It's quite often that you don't notice these shifts to start off with. But round about the age of 40, 41, 42, people start to feel some changes, which they do not put down to perimenopause because we're not accustomed to thinking of it in those terms, which is why I'm really passionate about getting the story of menopause out here. So there's no fixed number of symptoms. And we actually have to go 12 consecutive months without a bleed to be classed as menopause day. And if you get to like day 360 and you have a period, you have to start counting again. But once we've gone those 12 consecutive months, which is obviously a retrospective diagnosis, the very next day we are postmenopause. If we were to break down these time chunks from this circle represents 0 to 100. So if we're going to live to 100, the time that we are not bleeding from the age of up to like 12 years old, we then have the period of time when we're menstruating, very small section clusters premenopause. And then the time of perimenopause is slightly larger. Menopause day is just that one tiny segment, but the rest of our life, we are postmenopause. Now, the significance of that is that we are now living in a body that has very low levels of hormones. And the long-term health consequences of this are far outreaching, really, what we might think of as the symptoms at the time, and having to get through it are things that we often hear when people are struggling and challenged with those symptoms. But really, how you menopause is going to determine how you are post-menopause. The other things that we would then dig deeper into with an audience is how to build their menopause toolkit. And there's all sorts of things that you can put into the toolkit. And we spend a whole kind of hour or so helping them to build their menopause toolkit. And we also do talk a little bit about HRT and what that choice could look like and how they work and the different choices that people could make. But it's also important to understand this is about a whole person approach that is going to last you a lifetime. And then we have to consider that we have to take one day at a time as we're going along this menstrual health timeline, and the different things that we can do, such as breathing deeply to help reduce cortisol. By reducing cortisol, it improves the functionality of estrogen and progesterone. It helps the brain as well, because these hormones act as neuroprotectants and neurotransmitters as well. So there's so many things that we can do, but in a nutshell, that was how we would work through with a group of people in our support session. Now, we need to learn about this because the lack of information creates an incredible amount of overwhelm, and that can actually contribute to further anxiety and concern because you don't know what you don't know. Now, what I often say is that the mechanics of menopause have not changed, but the way that we lead our lives has. So what we're really facing today is something akin to a modern menopause, which is why building this menopause toolkit, starting with your menstrual health toolkit as young as you possibly can, and also then being at peace with the process and understanding that this is a transition. It's a timeline from the day we're born until the day we die. And the more that we take notice and understand how to manage our stress, how we rest, move and think, looking at real food, the movement that we do to stay healthy, and how we can breathe well to help reduce stress, and all important social connections as well, which I'm sure you guys really connect with, because how important it is to have community around you, especially when you have a newborn baby. Now, when we're going through all of this process, we might need guidance, which is why it was my mission to create a global collective of menopause doulas, or people that could speak with confidence, calm and clarity, and be safe and supportive with their knowledge that they can then facilitate the learning of others. But the biggest key to this whole process really is about learning to age well, because what we say is that healthy aging is directly related to healthy menopausing. The end.
Oh, that is just fantastic. I like that last saying. Yeah. Just great, really interesting. So now what was that word, that other word that you used? It wasn't written on the screen, I don't think. The other word that you used for menopause?
Oh, climacteric.
Oh yeah, how do you spell that one?
CLIMACTERIC. You're right, it was on one of the other slides. It wasn't on that one.
Climacteric.
Make sure I will make an edit for that one. Thank you.
That sounds far more interesting than menopause.
Yes.
Oh, I'm in climacteric.
Oh, well, guess who invented the word menopause? It was a male doctor in 1821. You know, he's not famous for doing anything else other than inventing the word menopause.
Do you know the sort of Latin derivatives or whatever, where the word?
Yeah, it's actually, it's Greek. It's the pausis was the word for stop, and menses is the monthlies. Okay, right. So that was where the word menopause comes from. Monthly, but in modern, yeah, but the modern language of the word pause doesn't translate to us, because we are used to seeing the pause symbol meaning temporary. So I think that creates a lot of confusion in the word itself. And yes, it's also used as an umbrella term, but it's really just that moment to reflect the stop. And everything before that is, you know, perimenopause. Prior to that, premenopause. So until we observe any changes, is premenopause. And then we've got this time zone, which is just really the time before menopause. And it's like, how long is a piece of string? And then the time after is postmenopause. So there's all the word menopause in there, which again is like great.
Yeah, so
but if
I
we
mean,
can
so
kind of,
often women
you
are
know,
saying, aren't they, that we would, the words would be, oh yes, I'm dealing with menopause. No, you're not. You're dealing with perimenopause
yeah.
and postmenopause. So quite interesting that menopause itself is really just a date, one day in time, 365 days after your last
you're fine.
menstruation. And that was, I found that interesting because I do remember somebody saying to me years ago that menopause, because somebody said that you need to be 2 years without a cycle, and at that point you have just begun menopause. So that's
It
really
kind
not
of,
quite right.
it depends. Yeah, it depends how you say it. So when you say I've begun menopause, you kind of have, because you've just started, right? But this is where the confusion is, because then you've actually started your journey towards menopause 4 to 7, potentially 10 years. It was my daughter who was helping me with the tech. When I started to research this, I was living in Spain, and a talk came up from a lady that had come over from Europe, and she was talking about hormonal decline. And I was like, oh, what's that? That sounds interesting. I think I need to go. And I said to Tessa, you need to come with me, because I've got this really what I now know is brain fog. And I just want to make sure that I've got somebody next to me to understand this, because I think this is going to be the thing I need to understand. Mm-hmm. And so when Tessa came with me, and she was the one that was asking more questions in this room of women, and it was a pharmacist actually talking about, hormonal decline, which is the one of the phrases that piqued my attention, which is kind of like this tipping point where we get to this tipping point of accelerated hormonal aging and ovarian aging. And afterwards, Tessa said to me, she said, Mum, what was I, 45, 46, 47? She goes, Mum, based on my diagnosis, I think you've been perimenopausal for 10 years. And I went, I think you're probably right. And then when we look at the science now, I go, yep. Because you can suddenly go back in your mind and you go, oh my God, yeah, I remember when that happened. Or I remember when my insomnia started, which is a perimenopausal symptom, right? I remember getting tinglings in my fingers, which is also, from a circulatory heart protective quality. A feeling of detachment, which the psychiatrists now tell me is dissociation. And that is an actual thing that's happening in our brain rewiring in preparation for postmenopause. But some of these symptoms, they come and go, which is why journaling and tracking is really helpful. So if we can encourage
bulk of the symptoms are obviously during the perimenopause phase, and once in postmenopause, is that when you'll find that for most women things kind of settle down?
For the large majority, but I still do often hear women in their 60s talking about, oh, I'm still getting hot flushes.
Gee,
and and how long is this going to last? But what we also know is that may not be directly related to the estrogen levels at that point, because there's lots of cofactors such as the food that we eat, how we move, our stress levels, that, the hormone collective, as I call it, estrogen is like that conductor of the hormone collective. And when estrogen is not there, there are other things that can be disrupting us. We just don't have the protective quality of estrogen once we get to postmenopause. So we might not get the mad fluctuations and changes and lots of different symptoms, but some women, depending on how they have traveled this journey, they may have experienced a certain amount of, let's call it wear and tear, that it means that any other hormone shifts that they experience due to maybe stress levels or insulin and things like that, they can feel them more and may have kind of like this residual feeling of symptoms. And I do know some women that have then, even come like late 50s, early 60s, have said, right, I am going to go on HRT because I really do not find joy in this anymore. I can't find what else to do to help live, monitor these symptoms.
And
So there's,
with the HRT, obviously that's had a bit of its own journey in a way that it came out as sort of the big solution, and then there were question marks on side effects, and then they've refined things and learned more. And I think that the HRT that's around now is more refined than what it was when it first came out, and we know that it does it's helpful for protecting things like cardiac issues, osteoporosis, etc. So with looking at the timeline, is there what you would think an optimal time for women to consider to be going on to HRT, or what's the common time, or where does that sort of fit in along that timeline that you're seeing?
Well, the medical opinion in general suggests that the earlier the better, but it's probably at a time when you're not even thinking about it.
Interesting.
Yeah, because we're not accustomed to considering it. Because if you think of it, I discovered that COVID was actually helpful in this terminology, because if you think about the peaks and troughs that you get in that we had, in that the number of people, and if we took the vaccine, it helped to smooth the curve, if you like. That's the same kind of thing with HRT. When the ovaries reach that tipping point, they go each month with the menstrual cycle. It's what I call the X factor competition. But once we reach the tipping point, that X factor competition can maybe not have as many contestants in it one month, and then the next month it will have more, and then some months it won't happen at all, and then it'll all of a sudden switch on, right? And this is the ovaries kind of winding down, but they do it in a much more erratic way than I had ever imagined. And so you have these really high ups and downs with the hormones. HRT will help kind of smooth that out and minimize the fluctuations. So it's not replacing in the same way that you might think of, say, with insulin or thyroxine or something like that, as a kind of top up in those things. But what it does, it helps to keep the threshold of the high and the low much narrower. And this is one of the reasons why it can help to minimize symptoms. But it can also help to be protective.
So you're saying that the woman could be taking it before they're becoming irregular?
Yes.
Interesting. So I think you're right. My stomach wouldn't even think about that.
Yeah.
And would that, in theory, I have to ask this question, would that in theory delay your menopause because you're keeping up? Okay.
No.
And that's
the
where you say why it doesn't work like insulin or thyroxine does, that it's a direct top up.
Yeah. And it's not contraception either. So it's not controlling the ovarian activity. Right. So your ovaries are still continuing their progress along the menstrual health timeline. But because
is there a time women would in theory stop it, or they could potentially be taking it, as you say, from their late 30s or early 40s, which is amazing, and what, for the rest of their lives?
That is the medical opinion that is possible now. Yes.
Right. And I think that,
but there are lots of things that you can do. So I must say, whilst I'm an HRT advocate, you still need to do all the other things.
Yeah.
The best results. And so we have a very ethical
diet,
approach.
lifestyle, the whole, yes.
So,
don't just rely on the pharmaceutical medicine.
So within our scope of practice, we have ethical guidelines. So we would never talk about, or you have to choose between a natural menopause or a medical menopause, or a chemical menopause. That's just irresponsible for somebody to say that, really. So you have to look at it as a bigger picture, because whilst in the ideal world that sounds really cool for HRT to be able to do all of that, if you think about it, if we are not getting on with our own hormones, you may not get on with HRT either. So you can't view it as a single solution. And by also looking at your menstrual health journey and supporting your menstrual health and your fifth vital sign and understanding and tuning in, you will be able to fill your menopause toolkit with lots of things as well as HRT, if that is something that, once you've looked at all the information, is your informed choice. But the other thing as well is, if you're somebody who really believes in holistic therapy and you find yourself incredibly challenged and you're putting as much into your menopause toolkit as you possibly can and it's still not helping, it's by no means any failure to then say, right, yes, I would like HRT. You have to come at this journey from a pragmatically, calmly, which is very hard when you're going through it and you don't know what's happening, which is why my campaign is to get people to go, right, so this is the story, this is the journey. And some ladies that hear the story, they're already kind of like maybe post-menopause, but they sit there and they kind of have a weight lifted off their shoulders, because they can look back and they can understand how they got to where they are, maybe what the missed opportunities were, but then also realizing, okay, I still have time now. These are the things that I can do, and let's look at taking my next best step forward. Because if you're in your early 50s, the average age of death in the UK of a female is 83. So you've got 30 odd years, okay, of looking at how you can be amazing, having an amazing post-menopause. And
and I think that's that's so much of the issue in a way, is that we are living longer. And it's just not that long ago within the whole human history where you if you were in your 50s, you were old.
Yeah.
And so we don't have thousands of years of women routinely living into their 80s. We don't.
Yeah.
Right, so there hasn't been that knowledge and wisdom passed on. And if we think how little, depending on how old we are and what sort of generation our parents came from, how little we were told about puberty,
Yeah.
and the birds and the bees. Well, they certainly were not talking to us about menopause.
No. But we didn't get much on menstrual health either. I mean, I didn't have a clue.
Yeah.
I would have a clue. And the interesting thing as well with regards to like the aging as well, and obviously I guess it's a global thing that a lot of mothers are later on in life now. They
absolutely, right? In fact, it clearly depends on the location, the demographics, etc. But a hospital that I used to work out of quite a bit as a caseloading midwife, where it was in an area that was, it's kind of seen as more upper demographic type of thing. And it probably 10 years ago, even maybe more than that, where might even be close to 15 years ago, where they just made the decision that they can't regard every woman who is over 35 as a geriatric pregnancy or advanced maternal age. Like they don't have the resources to deem everyone 35 and above AMA. Like they don't, because AMA means you have to have extra checks, and so they kind of just made this decision that no, 40 is AMA in this
okay,
right, because and also you know, the whole idea of 35 being advanced maternal age or geriatric, I mean, that information, you know, really goes back to, you know, the 50s and 60s and 70s of having babies. But, you know, we have so much more information now. You know, we can do scans, we can do higher tech blood tests. There's so much more that we can do, and women themselves are often, you know, in their late 30s, a lot fitter and healthier and more proactive.
But you imagine
care, right?
on their
than
menstrual
they were
health
50 years
journey.
ago.
Yeah, but on their menstrual health journey,
Yes.
they're ovarian aging, right? So they
Yes.
may have baby 38, 39, let's just say. Okay, so and then by the time baby gets 2 or 3, they are getting perimenopause, but they probably think that it's because they're running around after a toddler that they're exhausted and they've got brain fog, and then they've probably gone back to work and they've got all these other challenges and things like that. So it's really, in my opinion, worth being able to have that conversation with mums of any age to say, this is your menstrual health timeline, and these are things that are going to be happening here on in. And this is why, you see, I never use this whole self-care thing, right?
Yeah.
Who pays any attention to that when you're 30, right? Turns out, though, that's because you've got all this metabolic flexibility and all of this resilience that we get from our hormones, right? But then as we get to 40s and we think self-care is maybe luxury, but it's not. These are essential things to look at the food that we're eating, to de-stress. There's a great lecture with the International Menopause Society that talks about how cortisol impacts the effectiveness of estradiol in the brain. Now, go figure. You know, if I'd know, perhaps if somebody had told me like that, listen,
Basically,
sit
how
down,
stress is impacting.
Yeah, sit down and breathe, lower your cortisol, because otherwise this is going to impact your brain. And so you're in that turmoil of postpartum period, perhaps if you're, you know, you are the 35 plus or the 40 mum, then it's a real consideration for them to get to grips and understand their menstrual health timeline, because you rejoin the timeline where you would have been without pregnancy. So it's no time off for good behavior.
Right.
Right?
Yes. Okay. So, I mean, the fact that you have a pregnancy and you breastfeed your baby reduces your chances of getting breast cancer. But what you say is it makes no difference to your journey or your timeline. Yes, you don't get credits on that one.
Yeah.
And, you know, you made that comment that, you know, midwives in particular and doulas, you know, when they sort of doing those home visits, you know, after having a baby, you know, one of the topics that does have to be discussed, you know, is the fact that they will be having a cycle again, and these are options of contraception, and you know, just having a conversation around that, but bringing this topic into it, considering that, you know, so many women that we see these days, you know, are over 37 having babies. And who is probably nobody's spoken to them about menopause yet. So just bringing that topic in is quite an interesting idea. And the fact that you're not in menopause, that you are in perimenopause, you're postmenopause, but in menopause is
because you might just about get your cycle back, say regular, say 44 perhaps, you know, depends on, really does depend on you, and then it can become irregular, and then you're in mid perimenopause. So whilst we say there are there's no fixed order of these things happening, there are some common traits. So at the very beginning of the tipping point, you can get the sadness feeling that we describe as depression or anxiety or palpitations sometimes as well, and we do not connect that with perimenopause at all. Even doctors do not. but it is one of the early indicators. And the other thing then is the
Right.
terminology that we use. So years ago, when I first started studying it, there was the green climacteric scale. So that's an old standard of measuring signs and symptoms of perimenopause. And they were early indicators of perimenopause. And these things like the sudden feeling of sadness, the out of character sensations,
Mhm.
and the out of character feelings, perhaps like aching joints, and things that are unexpected, and sudden weight gain versus gaining weight during menopause, for example. Okay, so those early indicators are when we should be really listening. And it's the body telling us, okay, look, the ovaries are kind of like they're tapping their watch, right? But we don't
Their watch.
know. We don't know about them, so we don't even connect them. And then by the time you get to mid perimenopause, this is where, if there's going to be an irregularity in the periods, this is kind of more like when it starts. So irregular is not always just like the missed period. It's what's irregular for you. So if you were tracking your cycle before, has the cycle shortened, or has it got longer, or has the bleed changed? Because this is
And also,
again another indicator.
yeah, and within those cycles, when we're talking from a subfertility, fertility, infertility basis, and women do track their cycles and they believe their cycles to be irregular, or they are, and but then when they actually track them, what they'll often find is that the cycles are regular, because they're taking turns. So this ovary may have a 25-day cycle and this ovary has a 35-day cycle, so they go 25, 35, 25, 35, and
Yes.
they think, oh, I'm a regular, and actually no, there is a regularity going on. But
Yes.
even that, yeah, so that kind of adds to the confusion
Yeah.
as well, doesn't it? And I found it interesting that you made the comment that it takes 5 years, in puberty to get an average to get a regular cycle.
Mm,
And so often, you hear those situations where you've got sort of 15-year-olds going on to the pill because their cycles are regular, and
mm,
oftentimes encouraged by their mum, say, look, your
yeah.
cycle's so irregular, let's get you on the pill. Well,
Yeah.
that's not going to make the cycle irregular, that's going to make the cycle non-existent.
Yeah. But that's if we also then learn what these menstrual health indicators
Yeah,
mean, and how to, and then told the younger females that that hamburger that you had, or that McDonald's that you had like the week before your period, that is not helping. I know they're not going to necessarily listen when I say eat broccoli instead, but it's like there's a reason. Not every menstrual health problem can be solved, but a lot of it is the body saying, right, I'm deficient in something, or you're not doing enough of this and you're not doing enough of that. And then you can look at the challenges from a different perspective rather than medicating to start off with. And then, so if we were enabled with that information when we are, cycling naturally in, perimenopause, and then still kind of tuning in, you would then go, oh, okay, yeah, I'm ovulating. Maybe I need to take, not do so much cardio, or let me just, take it a little bit easy, or this week I need to be topping up on my greens so that next week when my progesterone hits, I don't turn to the biscuits, and learning just some of these simple nuances to improve our overall health. So as we get closer to perimenopause, we can spot these things a lot more easier, and then we can actually be positive, because we have to remember, we end up at the moment having to dive deep into this explanation and talk a lot about symptomology, which sounds really boring and drudgery, and I'm like, oh my God, really? But the more we understand previously what's going on, the more we can be right. Okay, so I'm going to feel a little bit fragile and tired next week. So I need to, plan ahead, have some meals already prepped, that are already really healthy, tell the boyfriend, tell the husband, we're getting to that time, and communicate and learn and understand so that you can optimize your strengths and protect your vulnerabilities. And then the same as when we get to perimenopause, it'll be a lot easier.
Yeah,
that's my vision. Okay, I have
I know, and I think that's just fantastic. And that's that kind of conversation that would ideally be going on, between a mother and a daughter, and leading her through that journey. And we just know it's not. It's menstruation is kind of this perceived as so often as this kind of interruption,
and an inconvenience,
and it only becomes of value when a woman wants to conceive, and then suddenly she's interested in what's going on with her own cycle, which is really sad, but we see it a lot. And because we get a lot of questions coming through in some other forums that I work with, that so many questions around trying to conceive and things taking longer, and that's the first time when a woman starts to really pay attention to her own cycle. Look, it's been absolutely fascinating having you talk, and we are going to be winding this up soon. So was there anybody watching that wanted to ask any live questions before we wind things up? But I thought, like, speak now. Or as my father would say, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Hold your peace, yes.
Because there may be some other fascinating things that you're dying to ask for yourself. So the idea that it all starts so much earlier than I think people kind of perceive things. What would be the so if we saying from some 37 onwards an average, it's the clock is starting to tick. What are the commonest early symptoms that you would say women are experiencing but often just ignore in those early times?
The one that they refer to as depression, because they don't know another word to describe it. It's kind of like a sadness and a disconnect, and you feel like you're not really there. And that is a very common one that gets talked about way before the hot flushes, way before anything else really. Sometimes the brain fog then follows quite closely, and perhaps the insomnia, and that's a very subtle one that creeps up on you as well.
That's so interesting. So a sadness that kind of disconnect, and the brain,
and that can be can be quite some time before your periods change as well, so that you notice the change unless you're really tracking.
And when you think of how many women are having babies over 37, so if you're 42 and you walk in to a doctor's office and you've got a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and you're saying I'm feeling sad, they're going to go straight to depression.
And then they give you antidepressant medication.
Right.
And that's what happens a lot.
Right. They'll be straight into the SSRI medication. Rather than perhaps the HRT.
And an interesting fact is that if anyone has experienced a depression, and in particular postpartum depression previously, they are more likely to experience the kind of perimenopausal depression as a symptom.
Okay. Interesting. All right. So we have some questions come. Thank you.
There's quite a lot of questions there, is that? I don't click any buttons.
I thought we better get these in. So have you written any books, Fiona?
Oh, books. Well, I have written a course. I've done one better, if you like. So I now teach people how to tell the story of menopause, how to help people build a menopause toolkit. So that's what we do at the Menopause School. So we help wellness professionals and holistic practitioners, or anyone who wants to create a confident conversation, this is how we do it. But yeah, there might be a kind of, there is a book, I have one, an audio book called Talking Periods, and that helps set the scene. So it's a set of 12 audios. So I did kind of have a book, so it's on the website. It's called Talking Periods.
Oh, and yes, could you go over your website and contact details?
It's themenopauseschool.com, and you'll find everything that you need there. We're on all the socials as well. So
fantastic. A few other questions come in here. So have you come across the work of Jane Hardwick Collins?
I have not, Josie. No. I will look that one up. Or she's in Australia doing amazing work on. Oh, okay. Then she sounds like my kind of person. And you have Lara Bryden, who is somebody that his book I do. He's based in New Zealand, I believe. She has a book called The Period Repair Manual, and that's certainly worth looking at as well. Hormonal impact of breastfeeding. Perimenopause, maybe say breastfeed longer.
Yeah, we'll just read this one out. So
yeah,
Josie also wondered if you have any thoughts around the hormonal impact of breastfeeding on perimenopause. My belief is that we would have breastfeeding for much longer in a tribal collective manner, not only our own children. Yeah, and that this would have a huge impact on hormones heading into perimenopause. Oh, okay. So basically, if you're 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, and you're still breastfeeding, because you're contributing to the village, is that the ticket to delay?
There, Josie, that there is, but it's also, you are still menopausing, don't forget though. So I like if you turn it into a verb, but because of the breastfeeding, the oxytocin stays higher for longer, and that helps to regulate your cortisol, which helps to regulate your insulin. So even if your estradiol is starting to do those wobbles, the impact will feel less on your symptomology. So there is method, there is, and plus the community aspect as well also helps with your oxytocin and things like that, and then being supported.
Delay the inevitable, but it's almost like a natural HRT. It's softening.
Yes,
it
is. You could see it like that as well. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
As long as mum's being supported and not being made to breastfeed, or not thinking that she's doing this, like, you're staying on me until you're 7 years old or whatever.
Or I'm just thinking, because a lot of places around the world, do have milk banks as well. And I mean, basically what it's saying is that, when your last child is weaning, there's benefits for you continuing to lactate
to a degree, because
the milk and give it to the milk bank.
I don't want everybody to start breastfeeding because I've said this, but but in the community setting, particularly as Josie said, so like what we would have had in that tribal setting. And this is also one of the other reasons they believe there's a few hypotheses as to why we menopause, and the community component is one of them. It's called the grandmother hypothesis. So we become, unable to have children, so that we are there to support those that do.
Yes.
And that we are able to keep that cuddle chemical going with nurturing and supporting females that are still reproducing. So there's it's the community element as well, and things like that. So
which again we're so disconnected from in modern Western society. So when you you tend to hang out with people who have children of similar ages, but being around young babies, again, you have to tend to wait till you're a grandmother yourself, and that's a long time.
Oh well, I ticked that one, so I'm grandma already. So I'm it's,
It's just fascinating. So look, that is just all. We have one other question, so we'll wind this up in a moment. We've oh, thank you. That is very validating. So lovely.
yeah.
Just
Thanks,
so look, do you want to anything that you would like to just conclude with, Fiona, and we'll wind this up?
I think really it's just about the healthy aging is directly related to health and menopausing, and that is the message that we need to be spreading.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your
You're
time
welcome.
today. When we booked this session, I was thinking, gosh, we're kind of going outside this maternity spectrum a bit. But I thought, you know what, there's so many women in this industry. I felt that this would be just a topic that could be personally of interest to a lot of our audience. But actually, what you've done today is really shine a light on how directly relevant it is to many of our own clients as well.
Yeah.
And the fact that it should be something that's getting discussed in that postnatal period, as we talk about periods and contraception, and we should also be talking about perimenopause, which might freak a few women out, I might say.
I get that.
Yeah, but and often even just mentioning a next period can freak a woman out, or mentioning the idea of contraception can freak. They go, oh my God, no, I haven't even thought about that yet. They've got this 4-week-old baby. But it's one of those things that could be put in there, particularly when we're dealing with women, and as you say, in their late 30s, early 40s. And it's so relevant to their fertility as well that, I think that women have it's often, there's the number 40 is up there as to when they start to really need to be thinking about, harvesting their eggs and other things like that. But actually it's happening just a few years earlier than that.
Yeah.
The turning of the tide.
It is.
All right. Well, look, thank you so much, Fiona. It was
Thank you for
lovely to have
inviting
you
me.
along today. And thanks to those who are live. That's always great. We
Yeah,
always
thank you for
appreciate our
listening and
live
watching.
audience. And we know that a lot of you are watching this afterwards. And so, yeah, we just want to wish you a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your week. So thanks, everybody. Thank you, Fiona. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.